Yeah, we're going to start this out with the putting my Patreon in the chat. It's also in the bottom of the description that you'll see right below. And that's how we're going to start this out. And that's how we're going to... but with this topic, I know that we thought it was going to be dead, and we weren't going to be talking about this really, but because of the factor of what ended up happening and them dropping the actual case for a mere $3,500 fine in community service, we end up having to talk about this again. And that's the actual point, that we end up having to talk about this whole thing again. And this is basically, I believe this is merely a situation where they are showing preferential treatment because of who he is and where it's taking place. And it's taking place in a democratic city. And this democratic city is basically showing preferential treatment to him. And since they are a city that does have hatred of Trump, and especially that this was especially done right after the Mueller report was announced and showing no collusion, I assume that that was part of the reason why they did this. They wanted to essentially kind of throw gasoline on the fire. So the way you throw gasoline on the fire is you basically, regardless of what all the evidence is showing, you basically state, hey, we're going to essentially give him a slap on the wrist. We're going to give this guy a slap on the wrist, and regardless of what he did. Now, when we start to look at what he ended up doing, he ended up essentially, now we can't describe this as with the same type of crime, but we have it mimicking the same motive for the crime of the Manson family of the 1960s, which was to essentially start a race war. And we know this specifically with what his actions were doing. He specifically was stating that that he had attacks on him from white MAGA hat wearing people that were stating racially charged, both racially and charged things, and statements that were charged against his sexuality. Now this is essentially was meant to create kind of a modern day version of what the Manson family was looking to create with their whole helter-skelter thing of essentially a race war. Now he was using the excuse of saying, oh, he was just looking for attention to get a raise from his job. Well, when we start to look at his current salary was about $1.1 million a year. To date, we have never seen anyone pull any type of stunt like this to get a raise. We've never seen anybody blame a political party or any type of political person to actually garner an actual raise. We might see any type of thing from like threatening a holdout to anything else, but nothing based on politicization, or nothing actually trying to fake something like this, or even trying to act in any way that you would actually try to cause a riot or a essentially almost a civil war within the country. The only types of people that would do this would be the people that actually wanted to do this regardless of what their pay was. Doesn't matter if they're making minimum wage, or doesn't matter if they're making could be nine figures a year. could be 10 figures a year. They really don't care. These are the types of people that basically this is their goal. They actually have a goal in mind of doing this, because they really don't care of the actual money is not the actual motivation. Because we can see that if they're doing that, that means money is not a motivating factor. If you look at the Manson crimes, money was never a motivating factor, because they weren't looking at stealing anything of wealth. Uh, they were looking on basically causing the bloodshed and blaming on black people, and then causing a race war. And that was their actual purpose with that. Now, this is where we need to do the comparison. And this is the actual thing. And when we find this now, his idea was essentially was to fake a hate crime, make people that he knew with it help him stage this fake hate crime, because this seems to be a modern way of doing it. Now, he didn't want to actually go through it. Now, he's not a type of person that would actually go through with actually killing someone. So he's not going to actually kill someone to do this. But he is as much of a sociopath to actually be a catalyst in willing to cause massive amounts of death in the country. Now, this needs to be understood, and this is something that we need to understand, that this is what he was willing to cause, and we need to understand this. And this is something that needs to be grasped from the actual core. And why a mere $3,500 in community service, regardless of the amount of community service, is not a fair crime. It's not a fair punishment, especially for the amount of felonies that he was facing. I mean, there's other people that have actually gone to jail for basically mere crimes that were not even legitimately facing events that were doing almost nothing. Now, he needs to understand that when it comes down to it, is that there are no legitimate reasons to there were actually no legitimate reasons to essentially drop these charges. Now, when we start to look at this, he is not this person that needed to have these charges dropped to begin with. And we need to understand that this is the point that it goes with, and people can state whatever they want, but that's the whole thing that needs to be understood. It was never about money to begin with, and the charges need to be understood that he is someone that should be considered very, very dangerous to actually have out there. And I think this is more about what they did is just to basically preserve a TV show that someone probably watched. They're probably saying, hey, he's a major actor and singer, so we need to preserve a TV show, and if we drop these charges, maybe we can preserve it, and people forget about this, and we can all move on. Well, the fact is the actions that he did nearly caused a national civil war, national riot, just as very much well as other events such as this whole Russiagate hoax did just as well. And we need to understand that as well, with everyone who perpetrated that is just as guilty with trying to start an actual war within the country. and you're trying to start riots within people and trying to have people kill each other. And there were actually people maimed over that, just because of what you did. And there were most likely people that actually did die from that with it. And this is essentially another thing in which they tried to, and that's Jussie Smollett case was basically he tried to essentially add gasoline on top of it because of his hatred of Trump. He had hatred of Trump, and he was basically trying to use this and essentially create more of it. And anyone with any brains knew that this was the actual origin at the start. And it was something that we could actually see from the start that it was a fraudulent case. There was no legitimate evidence. He was stating something where it was 2 o'clock in the morning. Okay, who is going to be basically standing out there at 2 o'clock in the morning? It's not going to be white. It's not going to be some white person waiting, a couple of white people waiting out for a black guy to walk out. And it's going to be it was, especially in January, it's going to be cold as hell. You're not going to be able to tell the race of the person walking out because you're going to be bundled up, because it's so cold. So to make that assertion with it is going to be insane. And you don't know who you're not going to, which means you're also not going to know who it is because it's so cold. And the actual, even if you have a street light, you're probably not going to still not be able to tell who the person is because of the actual limited amount of light out there. Which means that any type of legitimacy to the story is going to be is going to be vague at best. Which means if they uttered any sexual epithets at the person, which means if they were ever to do that, it would not necessarily mean that they implied the person was gay, that they were merely what it called just launching as a general insult, nothing more. And that's that when he was stating that they were what it called that they were launching epithets against race with it. Well, you can't tell if someone's black, white, or Hispanic or anything else in that type of cold weather. You're going to be so bundled up. Especially when you're talking, when you definitely have high temperatures for the day below 40 degrees. You're not going to be going out in you're not going to be going out in materials that late at night that are going to be allowing people to see much of your actual skin. So they can't really tell. And especially they're saying that he was saying that they poured something over top of him and it hit his hair. Well, it hit on top of him. Well, guess what? With it is, if it's that, he's not going to have anything really exposed, which is also another big, huge problem, because anybody with any logic would have said, okay, here's a problem with it, is that's not realistic, because nobody would have gone out in that type of temperature with that little bit of clothing and what it called expose their actual face, because it would have actually been so cold that it would have been unbearable. And especially it was supposed to be at that night one of the most cold nights of the year. Now, anybody would have realized that there was no legitimacy to the statements just within that, regardless of, this is not even using the actual evidence of the what we know of the actual makeup of the city. We haven't even gotten to that yet. And we haven't even gotten to that point yet of the actual legitimacy to that. When we actually look at the makeup of the people that vote of the political makeup of the actual city. Now, when we start to show that, so when we get to just within those points with it, you know that it's nearly impossible to actually recognize it, and his story tends to fall apart. Just within that, we haven't even gotten to the political end of it. So we know that it would be nearly impossible to recognize this person, for them to recognize whatever victim, and we know that the victim is not would have been lying about what they were wearing, and if they were wearing what it called wearing lighter about wearing lighter clothing where they could have been actually seen. So we know that that's an actual lie right there. That's saying that he was just in a regular puffer jacket. So we know that's an actual lie, because that's nearly that would be uh, that could have actually been very, very detrimental to your health wearing just that and pants. That would be because your whole face is exposed, and that would be so cold it would be unbearable. And it without any type of hood uh, to actually protect you, that would be meaning that you'd be essentially exposed, and it means that you'd be basically uh, exposed to the elements, and that would be you could you're talking even just for a short period of time. Your health is seriously at risk for that type of temperature, especially when we're talking the amounts of wind chill, and especially that time of night. Just even in that season, regardless of what we know about the weather that night. Now that night was supposed to be one of the coldest nights of the year. If not, I think it was the coldest night of the year yet to of yet to the point with it. So if we take that data in, we know that the story is completely unfathomable. Now we start to add in the points of the political end of it, and we start to take in the political makeup of the city. Now, the political makeup of the city shows that they are actually there is really almost no Republicans within the city. It is 88% Democrat. They pretty much are lockstep Democrat within the city. So so someone going in there saying this is mega country, that's not even plausible. They would be essentially they'd be essentially considered to be insane, because that's not exactly legitimate. That wouldn't be legitimate or anything reasonable of a statement to make. They would never make this statement in Chicago, regardless of neighborhood, because pretty much neighborhood by neighborhood is going to vote on the Democratic side in the Democratic ticket. Whether one neighborhood might have a slightly better chance of getting a conservative or a third party to vote for it is variable with it, but pretty much they don't, out of that other 12%, that does get mixed between the Republican Party and the third party tickets. That's not all Republican Party that votes for the other 12%. That does, and in many cases, it does split between Republican Party and third party tickets. So and certain areas might have a little bit of a better shot than others, and this is very, very important to note. And when we start to look at the actual case, it starts to fall apart. And so with this whole thing with it is, we need to understand that this is why the actual punishment did not really fit the crime, is because we knew it was a lie from the start. We knew that it was basically, it never there was never any story that materialized at all. So it's pretty much as open and shut of a case as you can get. I mean, you could pretty much say, we know you're lying with it. We have all of this data. any citizen in the whole world can basically prove this. And we can actually we can either A, show by video that this is not true, or B, we can show by or B, what we can do is we can actually show by the political makeup of the area that this is not true. And really, when it comes down to what was actually the outcome, is it shows that it was basically political. It was basically done as most likely as revenge for the outcome of what I would see as the outcome of the Mueller report. I would assume that they assumed that the Mueller report was going to have a complete and utter different outcome. And I think that's what was the point. And I think this is where we get to that point, and why people thought that, hey, we think the Mueller report is going to have a different outcome, and we think it's going to actually have that with it. So and I think it impacted with what they did with this. And you might think, well, where does that pull into this? Well, it does pull into this a little bit, but it does because of when the timing with it is. Because you look at timing is very, very suspicious. Because we're talking, it's just only a couple days away, and they're doing this specifically, I think, as an actual term of revenge, of saying, hey, this was able to clear the president, so we want to essentially kind of get one to clear one of our own, and in a way that we know that he was clearly guilty and clearly starting a race war, and because they believed that the president was guilty, so they wanted to basically do this in a way that's that they were basically going to give him essentially a slap on the wrist. And I think that's what we're talking about here is, I know it seems a little bit off topic, but it's that really, when it comes to timing, I think that really does go into the whole point. And that needs to be understood. And I think that we need to go into those parts of the topic of why the timing of these things were happening. Because if we start to look at when the Mueller investigation was wrapping up, we need to understand that all of a sudden this came through, and they basically dropped the case, and they said, oh no, we're not going to give you anything but a little tiny fine, which was nowhere near the actual cost of the case. If you look at the actual fine, it would have been nowhere near the actual cost of what it actually cost the city. Because the fact is, we knew that what he did was essentially cost the city quite a bit of money. And if we break it down, we kind of usually have an idea of what the man hours cost, and we know about how many man hours it would be with it, just within the amount with it. We know it's well beyond $3,500 just within the man hours. This doesn't include other resources used that of the actual resources that were used during the actual time. But we can pretty much guarantee the man hours used on this whole case were well beyond $3,500. It could have easily been close to, I would say close to, what is that, 100 times that amount. And I think that would have been, if you wanted to do a fine on that, I would have said a if you want to do a fine based thing with it, it's just that would have been just with it. But if you want to do that plus community service, it would have been and but I would have had him do an insane amount of hours of community service. I would have had him do essentially what would had to been like 8 hours of community service a day for at least basically and it would be Monday through Friday, and I would have him at least do it for 2 years, and to basically make him not be able to act for those 2 years unless he was going to do it on the weekends, and make him where he could not get out of community service, and so we're talking. What's that? So about 4,160 hours of community service I would recommend. And I think that would have been a fair amount. And then mix that with a fine of about $350,000. And I think that would have been a fair amount if they wanted to go with fine and community service. But I think there needed to be a severe punishment. I guarantee you, from the community service, from what I've read on the case, it's not much. From what I've actually seen on the case, it's yeah, it's $3,500 with $500 with a promise of additional $500 later, and that's with one of them, and then and let's see what the amount of community service is set at. He's supposed to surrender his $10,000 bond. Let's see. And yeah, it looks like they're not stating the amount of community service yet. That's what I thought. So that they're not stating the amount. But I think what it calls, but it's probably not going to be that much. They're probably not going to make him serve much time for community service, and that's going to be kind of what it's expected to be. And because I think it boils down to this being a political decision as well. Because if you look at the actual timing of the matter, and that's something that needs to be understood. And it needs to be understood that it's basically something that is basically because they're doing it, I think, because of a lot of political things that have gone on in the last week, and they wanted to kind of, I believe this is something where they wanted to kind of make their own little win, and this is something in which they were trying to do this to make their own little win. But we still have but what's still hanging out there is the potential for federal crimes, and this would essentially be a terrorism charge for essentially trying to, for the act of what he was doing, uh, which would, of what he was essentially trying to do with all of this, and that would essentially be a even more serious crime than anything else, and that would land him even in even more hot water than any of the other total felonies would have, because they were lower felonies. This would be a serious felony if he was charged on a federal crime of terrorism because of his actions that he did. Now if they actually pursued that, and I think if they find out that this was actually done in response to the outcomes of the political environment, and if they find out that that was the reasoning for them dropping these charges, I think that we might see that they will bring those charges upon Smollett, and they will pursue the maximum punishment. Because I think you're going to find out that that's going to be the case. Because if we have people out there that are essentially trying to give slaps on the wrist for people that are trying to cause race wars because they don't like certain political beliefs, uh, and are essentially trying to create these situations and make essentially a civil war out there. I think we're talking that you're going to find it be slapped right back at them, especially if a lower court, especially if a lower local court was doing this essentially as revenge for the outcome of a political, from essentially a special counsel that never started with any evidence and was trying to create some type of case against the president. And I think that this is something in which, if they did this, I think he's going to be in some serious trouble. And meanwhile, and he's going to have to deal with other charges, and this is going to be something that we're going to see in the future. Now, he's not done with what potential things could come his way, and I think this is something which is very, very important to understand. And I think this needs to be understood that he could actually be dealing with federal charges of terrorism, and that's the main charge that we're dealing with on the federal level, and that is a serious charge. And if they believe that is on a grand scale, he probably could never see the light of day, and they could essentially view him as a serious threat. Now, obviously, because he is a U.S. citizen, they're not going to ship him off to Gitmo. You actually do get your own trial. But what you're going to be doing is you're going to be getting basically slapped so damn hard that you're never going to be seeing the light of day. Now, because it didn't amount to any deaths, he would probably be likely to get something close to 50 years in prison without any chance of parole. That would make him closer to his 80s, the time that he would actually be able to exit. Basically, since he's in his upper 30s, I believe he's about like a year older than I am, so he'd be in his upper 30s. So he would be in his upper 80s, so he would probably die in prison, and it would pretty much be a death sentence for him. And this would be essentially what would end up happening. Now, he might be able to get a lighter sentence, probably closer to 20. He might be able to see if he can kind of work it down to like closer to 20 years in prison, because it wasn't exactly because he wasn't directly committing violence. So, but still, 20 years in prison, in a serious prison, is going to put him at in his upper 50s, and after that, no one's going to want to hire him, because he didn't start from essentially reformed. He wouldn't be like one of these actors starting from the case of reforming his life, like a Danny Trejo or something, where someone reforming their life and then getting into acting. He would essentially be an actor and singer before, and then basically going completely downhill, and then no one's gonna want to see them, because they're gonna see what they did, and they're gonna see, and it's going to turn people's stomachs. And it's and even now today with it still turns people's stomachs regardless. And it doesn't matter if he gets out or not. It's still he pretty much turns people's stomachs as is. So he's basically ruined his reputation, and he doesn't have much selling power. Even though his name's gotten bigger, it's not through being famous. It's not being famous. It's being infamous. And you don't want to be infamous, because the fact is it doesn't work for getting money. It basically, if he tries to sell some like life story, guess what? No one's gonna watch it, because they're gonna say, we don't like you. The only way stories are gonna be sold on him is basically through other people making money, and it's going to be basically showing the negative part of him and showing how much of a sociopath he is. And you've basically handed a bunch of money to other people to make stories about you. And from Jussie Smollett's perspective, and he just basically gave a lot of people a lot of money to basically make stories about him, and he does not reap 1 cent of any of that money, because he doesn't have any access to that. And he essentially can't tell them, oh, you don't have the right to write that about me. Well, he can't do that, because there's a little thing called freedom of speech. They can write whatever they want, and we have freedom of press as well, in which they can make documentaries anytime they want, and that's what he's going to have to deal with. And he's going to have so many negative stories being written about him within the next probably 5 years, and it's going to show him as this complete and utter piece of garbage. And then it's going to show him this whole complete fall from grace, and it's going to show him this complete and utter piece of garbage. And it's going to mention the DUI out in Los Angeles, Los Angeles County, in which he tried to pin a DUI on his brother by using his brother's ID. It's gonna show him with this, and it's gonna basically show him how he basically had pretty much a storied and protected life, and how he basically, by being a prima donna, how he basically threw every bit of it away. And he's probably going to be one of these people that ends up dead in the gutter of drug abuse, and he's probably going to be dead within probably, I give him 7 years, and he'll probably be dead by a heroin overdose. No, and one of these forgotten actors that no one really cares about. And frankly, with it, he's just going to be like, oh, he's dead. Never really cared for him anyway. And that's the way it's going to be. There's going to be some people that are going to do their little fake weep that he's dead with it in about 8 years from now with it, and about the age of 45. They're going to be doing that on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, that they always do whenever anybody famous dies. But that'll be about it with him, regardless if they knew who the hell he was anyway. But that you always get that with no matter who it is. But we know that's coming with it. Because we know he was we know that he's already admitted to using MDMA and other things as well. So we know that he's not exactly living the cleanest of lives, and we know he's not going to live that much longer. So when he's dead in the gutter with it, he's not going to be missed. People are going to move on, and they're going to go on to the next little big star that's going to do the same damn thing. And they're going to keep copying the same damn thing with it. People are not going to miss him. He's just a dime a dozen, and he needs to realize that. And basically, if he realizes that now with it, he needs to realize that nobody cares about him. He's a nobody. He always will be a nobody, and he will die a nobody. Because the fact is nobody really cares about him. There's nothing special about him. And that's the whole point. And him being this arrogant really shows that he is so much of a sociopath that he can't even understand out of his little tiny little bubble that he has no talent, that basically he's no different than anybody else, and that no one really cares. And that basically is that, he needed to understand that basically no one, until he committed this horrible act, nobody knew who the hell he was. That should be a little clue with it. And that should be a little clue that he should not have been earning 7 figures to begin with. And it should show him how meaningless he is and insignificant how he is in the actual world. That no one knew who the hell he was out there before this actual atrocity occurred that he committed on himself for attention and to start a race war. That basically nobody knew who he was. He was a nobody. He was some schmuck down the street. Nobody knew who he was. You really think people that voted for Trump actually knew who the hell he was? They wouldn't care. They don't really give a rat's ass about him. They knew he was. They didn't know who the hell he was, and the fact is he's just going to be remembered as a nobody. And he needs to understand that he's always going to be a nobody. And there's plenty of these nobodies out there that are basically that think they're great, and he's just another one of them. And when it comes down to it, is they need to understand that if you're a nobody, you need to realize you're a nobody and stop complaining about your life and move on. The fact is you need to be thankful that you are making 7 figures for being a nobody. How many people can say that as a basically that we're basically where the majority of the country doesn't know who the hell you are, and you're making seven figures? How can you actually complain about that? You can't. There's nothing to complain about. You should actually be thankful to everything in the world that you can actually earn seven figures, actually $1.1 million a year, and actually have where the majority of the country does not know who the hell you are. They know about your show, but they don't know who the hell you are. They don't know that and that you actually can have the privilege of having a music career, and no one knows who the hell you are. And you need to understand that that is a actual privilege. And yet he complains, and yet he would actually sit there and complain, which shows you how whiny and prima donna this person is. And and this is a person that needs to actually learn a few things first, and learn how privileged he is. When they say check your privilege, well, guess what? There's your privilege. There's no such thing as white privilege, but or whatever type of racial based privilege with it. But there's, when it comes down to people actually being born into a certain privilege with it, yes, there's people like him, because frankly he is completely oblivious to what actually he has as privileges, and he can't stop whining. He has to actually try to ruin the lives of other people because he's not happy with himself, because he is so miserable with who he is as a human being. And that's where we got to with this case, and that's why he did all of this, because he is miserable with himself as a human being. That's why he has to basically cover up for the whole thing by using drugs. That's why he has to cover up for the whole thing by trying to blame other people and trying to basically start a race war. It's because he doesn't like who he is as a human being. And instead of actually saying, okay, I want to improve myself as a human being, instead of trying to basically do all these other things, no, he wants to actually do the self-absorbed thing and blame everyone else. It's not my fault, it's everyone else's fault. And instead of actually looking at yourself and saying, how can I improve myself to actually go out there and actually be a better human being? No, he doesn't do that. That would actually be looking as an individual and actually try to improve that. Now, he doesn't do that because he believes in collectivism. No, he wants to actually blame everyone else out there. Okay, well, we have actually finally have a comment. If so, I'm responding that to it right now. I was just responding on the chat with it because I had one response because they would have called. They said they were stating someone wanted to cover up a race war attempt. LOL. And I was responding back basically is I wasn't stating that someone wanted to cover it up. I was saying that he wanted to that Smollett was the one who wanted to basically to to actually engage this thing. I was not stating that someone wanted to cover it up. Nobody's wanted to cover this up. He was one wanting to actually commit the actual thing. Nobody's actually covered it up. It's actually been quite obvious in people's faces right here all along. What actually happened was that basically was the race war was actually sitting in front of people's faces the whole time. And what we actually had was it was something. The thing that was actually happening was we had it sitting in. We had it sitting in front of people. We had basically the idea was sitting in front of people the whole time, and they're kind of really oblivious. If we start to look at, we needed to compare with previous cases of what people have actually done to commit race wars, and you look at what he was actually doing, and this is very, very simple. When we start to compare with previous cases of people that actually tried to, and we look at the attempts with the Manson case. The Manson case, they were trying to pin it on blacks. We can also go with the Atlanta, what was the case? What's the actual name of the killer? With the Wayne Williams cases, where he was where his excuse was that it must have been the KKK. Well, when we start to look at it, it was that we know that the actual areas that he ended up going to were, it would have been impossible. And that's, we know this, that this because these the areas in Atlanta were actually mostly were actually mostly were pretty much black areas. And if there were people that were actually not even just KKK but actually white in the area, it would actually toss off people, and they would actually be very, 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 very wary of it, and they would actually kind of bring on suspicion, and this should actually be known. And it's actually something that's very, very that should be very, very obvious to people when we start to look at the cases. And we need to understand this, and we need to understand that when we start to look at this is when we look at the actual case of Smollett, we should understand that that it was basically he was essentially trying to come up with one of these outlandish stories to essentially create the same perception. And while we're not comparing him that he's an actual serial killer, I'm using the actual where we're actually using comparison is with the actual motivation and of what he's trying to actually create there and in these cases. And it was essentially to start a race war because they know that a race war will essentially eliminates essentially will get their outcome. Now that was the race war was essentially not only his motivation, but actually part of his actual crime in itself. If we start to look at it. Now, if we start to look at actually with the what another point that I brought up here in the chat is you'll see is also the timing of the way that the Chicago court system actually when they actually revealed with the how they're going to deal with the charges. Now we know that when they started to announce the original court date, I believe that was supposed to be April 17th was supposed to be the date. And if we look at the date today, it's March 26th. We're still a little bit shy of when the next court date was supposed to be. So if we look at that, we can actually see that even though we had a clear-cut and open and shut case where he could have easily been prosecuted and basically he could have been basically blasted for all of these things, and any judge out there would have given him the full extent of the punishment. You could have argued for the stiffest penalty, and any judge in the land, regardless of how liberal the judge was, they would have said, okay, we agree with you, and they would have given it to you. And this is something that needs to be understood, is any judge would have allowed it. And this is something that would have happened. And this is something that we could have easily we would have easily seen. And what they're doing, it is almost seems like to basically what they're trying to do is try to almost offset the point of the Mueller charges. And it could be both to give the media something else to talk about, because this essentially makes it very easy for the media to talk about something else, because the media really screwed up with this one over a 2-year period. I mean, you could definitely agree with that one on the Mueller investigation. I mean, if they would have actually looked at that one with facts, they would have actually seen it never started. It never started with any evidence. It actually started with zero evidence, unlike the Smollett case, which had mountains of evidence to basically show that he was lying about his whole case. And this was basically a whole big point to and it was a whole big point that they kind of screwed that one up. Now this is basically to get them kind of off the hook and talking about something else, so that they can kind of push the Mueller investigation under the carpet, and then they can say, nothing to see here, let's move along. And then they can go on to their next thing about starting to bash Trump. Not saying I support Trump or that I'm against Trump, but this is kind of their whole purpose. And this can work as an actual distraction, and because it ends up being a huge surprise, which is, if you look at the actual difference in date, we can actually see that there is a more than 3 week difference between when the case was actually supposed to happen. Now, they could have easily waited for the actual event to happen and do it actually at the court date, but they actually decided right now. Well, if you look at right now, it would actually act as some type of political cover. If you wait till the actual court date, then you allow a lot of these things on the legacy media to start brewing, and there's a lot of negative feelings towards the legacy media. The legacy media starts crashing in ratings, and this will impact them on a severely negative factor. Now, if you add another huge story into the mix, this changes everything out there. And this is the whole point. And this is something that is really kind of odd with it. I mean, even we have a recent post on Twitter of from Judge Andrew Napolitano. Now, he is a libertarian judge, and he refers to dropping charges against Jussie Smollett almost unheard of. Now, he is essentially stating right there that the dropping of the charges is basically would have been essential, especially with a slam dunk case like that, would have been completely unheard of for anything. Now, this means there has to be some type of motivation behind this, and we need to understand that this goes to certain types of things. Now, there's a lot, and I believe there's a lot of political motivations behind this, and that's what needs to be understood. Now, it doesn't matter what people are saying with this whole big hogwash of justice for Jussie and those other morons doing that, and they still believed him even after he spit out all of his lies. And it doesn't really matter what you're doing with that, and it doesn't matter with all those people stating all of that garbage, and it really doesn't matter with all of that. So when we start to actually look at facts, now I don't look at the people who are going to believe him that no matter what. Now, if we start to look at what he was actually doing, this was his actual motivation. We know his motivation was with what he was actually doing. Now, we can actually see that his motivation was to start a race war because of his statements that he was trying to get across, trying to state something that never happened. And we know it never happened because we have video footage. And since you have video footage, that's actual legitimate evidence, and it completely contradicts what the actual statements he made, and he actually entered in an actual plea of not guilty. Well, when he's doing this, this means that he's essentially believing his own lies. If he's believing his own lies, that means we have an actual point that this is actually something in which he's calling his own lies the truth. And we need to understand this. Now, there's going to be people out there that still believe that when he was lying, he was telling the truth. You're always going to have people out there that are always going to be fanboys regardless of this. And the fact is you have this person up here stating someone wanted to cover up a race war attempt, LOL. Well, the fact is no one wanted to cover up a race war attempt. There was an actual race war attempt by Smollett. No one actually covered it up with it because it was blatant. And the fact is there's people that are going to be this justice for Jussie hogwash, And the fact is people believe that he was telling the truth regardless of the actual facts. We have the facts that there's actually evidence out there that state that he was lying. And he was lying all along, and there was actually motivations behind it. Now, he's a very disturbed individual. Yes, we have to admit that, but the fact is uh, we have we have to understand that that's when we start to go with the facts is there's certain things with it. Now, the timing makes it very, very suspect of when they did it. Now, the reason why with this is because of the timing of the Mueller investigation. Now, we know that the Mueller investigation was meant basically just to kind of take out Trump, but when they basically didn't have any evidence because everybody refused to turn, this end because of the actual case that ended up leading to no actual no actual indictment because they weren't because nobody refused to turn, which meant that everything was based on a complete and utter waste of time. So what they did, so the report is going to state is going to basically reiterate uh, false charges on your false charges on the report itself on the base from the intelligence agencies that are based on hearsay and conjecture, and then it goes back now then we get back to the Smollett case. Now we get to the idea of why were they timing it specifically then when we had the actual point of the why were they timing it then when we have an actual point of the when we had the when they had the case at the I believe the 17th or 18th or something or 16th or something somewhere around there when they actually announced this. Well, the fact is that means that they wanted to kind of set it up so that it was they were hoping they'd be around the case around the time when the Mueller investigation came out, I assumed. And since they didn't, and I think they had this idea of dropping it from the start. And this is something that's very, very disturbing. And I think they actually had this from the start that it was going to be dropped, and they were just going to give him a little slap on the wrist because if you look at the fine, look at the fine is nowhere near the actual cost of the case. Now, to me, with it at least, if we're going to be talking about the what he should be liable for, is for the cost to the city, because he wasted he wasted the city's resources. Now, if we're talking about a liberty-based solution, he should essentially be returning whatever waste that he did to the city, and this should be the whole point. And this is why we talk about this: is he should be returning that, and regardless of the actual people, the initial people that would come to the actual discovery of different things such as homicide and all these other points, and discovering new homicides out there that help aid in the which is usually the regular beat cops, which would actually be out there to call in homicides, and which help get leads on the actual homicide cases in which he actually caused them to be halted, because these were then taken off the case and were a lot of times diverted. And this is the whole point, and this is where this $3,500 fine and even the removal of his bail money really does not pay for it. So what is it, 13,500 plus maybe an extra 500? So we're talking about 14 grand. 14 grand does not pay for the whole investigation. It was guaranteed over that amount because the time that we're talking, there was more just even in wages, there were more than that amount of wages used, plus the actual physical resources. There were more than that just in physical resources used. We can guarantee you that the amount used was basically probably closer to uh, between $250,000 to about $350,000, if not closer to about a half a million, wasted on him. And this is the whole point that needs to be understood. And the outcome that it could have happened if this was not stopped sooner could have where people were actually being aware of kind of the inconsistencies in the story, and which came about from a lot of the independent and citizen journalism, actually was could have actually developed into this race war that he wanted. And that's the whole point. And this is where we get to some troubling factors, and we need to understand that. And we need to end what he was trying to do. And it could have actually been something horrible, because especially going with Chicago, you have a few million people there that could have actually suffered a massive fate because some little thug wanted to actually cause trouble in the area. And now we look at what could have actually spread from there, because that's a centralized location in the country that could have spread across the whole country like a virus that would have actually captured the whole nation. And we look at the actual implications, and that's why they were the charges should have been giving him the full extent of the law. And with this, I'm probably just going to end it right here. With it looks like we're getting about what we're going to get for the whole chat. If you like it, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure you share it all around social media. Make sure, if you can't donate to the Patreon, give it to someone else who can. And that's about it. And I will see you guys later for my podcast, which is about midday, and but like a little bit of afternoon-ish with it, and then for my nightly